about it. What's the archaeological evidence about the ancient city of Kerma? So let's talk about that today. Let's jump into that and let's start to get right into this. So if we think about the ancient city of Kerma, we're really talking about an area of the world that is in today's Sudan. And there's so much conversation. There's so much that's been talked about in terms of ancient Kerma and ancient Nubia and ancient Kush. I wanted to kind of come to you today to talk about this and let's explore some of the archaeological evidence and archaeological findings. And let's put this in simple terms. What is Kerma? What was it? When did it exist? Let's kind of jump right into it and kind of get right into it. And as we go through that, I'm going to be walking through a resource because I like to have writing and documentation. Well, a lot of what I talk about, I want to have writing associated with it. So I'm going to be walking through a resource that talks about the ancient city of Kerma. I'll say up front because I get this question a lot from people. How can I support you? They'll say, Danita, how can I support you? How can I support blackineducation.org? Well, I give you one way you can support is to share this video, like this video, subscribe. But you can also, look at some of my books. I've written more than 10 books on books about stories about Black history, 10 things your child should know about reading, writing, and math. If you're interested in that type of content when it comes to math and reading for elementary school kids. Also stories about Black history in terms of a volume, and they can't pull this up. So I have several books, many books that I've written that are on Amazon and on my website, blackineducation.org. You can find more about it. So I'd like to point you to that if you'd like the help and support. I really much appreciate it. So God bless you. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about the ancient city of Kerma. Let's talk about what we can find about Kerma. What does Kerma mean, and how can we jump into it? Now, I'll point out to you up front this. I'll give you this perspective right here up front, or you can see this video, an aerial view of the ancient city of Kerma and from one of its temples. And you can get an idea of how vast this area is, how large this area is, and how much is going on in this area. So there's a lot that's taking place here. And as we think about this, we're talking about, when are we talking about? We're talking about some 2,500 years before Christ. That's what we're talking about. So when we talk about the development of ancient Kerma and when it came into being as this particular kingdom of Kerma, we're talking about 2,500 years before Christ, 2,500 BC. And as we talk about that and we jump into it, I want to give you some time periods again to kind of put your mind in a timeline to help you, if you will, because archaeologists have designated certain time periods to look at this area, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But one of the time periods and one of the first things to know is that there's a pre-Kerma culture. We're going to be talking about the kingdom of Kerma and the city of Kerma from an ancient standpoint from about 2500 BC and thereabouts. But I want you to know that there's a pre-Kerma culture. There are people here, obviously. This is the Nile Valley. This is close to where human beings and civilization began. There are people all up and down this area long before 2500 BC. So there are people there. And in this pre-Kerma culture, which they designate to being about 3500 to 2500 BC, this is contemporary with the pre-dynastic era of ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet. So pre-dynastic Egypt, pre-dynastic Kemet, you have pre-Kerma cultures also going on as well. And it overlaps with the Old Kingdom. And when you start to get into the kingdom of Kerma that we're going to talk about, this particular distinction that rose, you're talking about overlap with the Old Kingdom moving all the way into the New Kingdom. So you're also talking about another 1,000 years of history. So we're talking about, at least 2,000 years of history in this area, as well as much beyond that, because as I mentioned, this is the Nile Valley. This is near the area where people began, where human beings are from. And this is in Africa. People are all up and down this area for many thousands of years, for tens of thousands of years before this, prior to this. So, but as we talk about, so what area of the world are we talking about? Like, where are we talking about? What area are we talking about? We're talking about right out here. So if you can kind of take a look at this map here, you can see the Sudan. And if you see this arrow pointing here, you see the city of Kerma. And so we don't know exactly what the people who lived during this time, 3,000 years before Christ, 2,500 years before Christ, what they called themselves. Because we don't have a writing system that we found that we discovered associated with them at this time. So we don't know what they called themselves. But the city of Kerma is there, and it's near the site of this ancient area where all this archaeological evidence has been unearthed. So it's called the kingdom of Kerma. They kind of call it after Kerma. So it's called that, but we don't know if that's what they called themselves. But it's called the kingdom of Kerma. That's what you'll hear referring to. And if you want to look it up or search it yourself, you can find it. And it's right about the third cataract, the third rocky area of the Nile, the third major rocky area of the Nile. That's right around where it is. And the interesting part about this is that it's a huge kingdom. It's an expansive kingdom. And when you look at it, one of the major things that jumps out at you, this kingdom is its temple. So this is the Dafufa. And a Dafufa in African terms, it means simply a mud brick man-made building. So it's a mud brick man-made building. And you'll find, many of them in Africa, but this one is kind of unique. And the city of Kerma is kind of unique. Well, this huge temple, the Western Defufa, is the central part of the city of Kerma, if you will, the central part of this ancient city. And this ancient city is huge. I mean, this ancient city is not just the site that I'm showing you. It's a site that's here, as well as some places slightly north, as well as some urban centers around it, as well as a port that's right off of the river, off the Nile. So it's a huge, massive complex, as I've mentioned and kind of showed you. But it is a place that's in the major part of the city, the major urban area of the city, the major focal point is the temple, and it's this Defufa. So the Defufa's there, and around the Defufa you have these circular buildings, circular architecture. You have things like a major audience hall where the king would have been there to be able to receive his subjects or receive foreign dignitaries. You have industrial workshops where they're making pottery and all types of wonderful things they're doing with faience and things of that nature. You have homes in this area, and many of the homes, according to archaeological findings, are single room homes at this time in the early part of Kerma and early in its history. They're single room homes that some of them may have a courtyard where they have like a gate with the courtyard and maybe some silos or things in it to help them store grain and store food. And some of the archaeologists will say that, the homes that you find in Kerma at this time, in the early Kerma period, early in its history, are contemporary with the types of homes you find in Egypt, in ancient Kemet, in Giza, and in Aswan. So this is not something that's that different from what's going on in Giza at this time and in Aswan in terms of the homes where people are living. Now, you do find also larger homes that have multiple buildings, larger courtyards, places for livestock, places to store grain and to store food. So that's also found here. But you find this industrial complex centered around the Defufa, centered around this major temple in this huge area that is kind of spread out over a large space, if you will. And what you find is you find a lot of circular architecture. You find a lot of comments and things having to do with their interaction with people and trade. It is believed that the people in Kerma at this time, and as time went on into classic Kerma, as this time period went on over 1,000 years of history, continue to have an open relationship and trade with the people south from them in Central Africa, and obviously north in ancient Kemet, even east toward Punt and places in the east and various parts in that part of Africa. And that at some point in time they may have had coalitions that developed between the people in Kerma and the kingdom of Kerma and kingdoms farther south, maybe kingdoms that were around the city of Darfur now, what is Darfur now, and places further south than that. And apparently, from some Egyptian literature, you'll find Egyptians and Kemetic people referring to coalitions that they have to face when they go farther south into this area that they eventually call Kush, that they sometimes call Yam. And so it's important to note also, because this area, I mentioned it, we don't know exactly what they call themselves. We do know that the ancient Kemetic people, the ancient Egyptian people, started to call this area Yam at one point in time. They initially called it Yam as they referred to Upper Nubia, Upper Kemet, or Upper Nubia. And they also eventually started to call it Kush. And I think the word Kush is not used until about 2000 BC. So there are interactions going on well before 2000 BC where it's called Yam and called other things, but they started to use Kush in the kingdom of Kush around 2000 BC. You also start to see around that time, as the Middle Kingdom is beginning, the Egyptians and the Kemetic people built forts right around that boundary, around the Second Cataract or thereabouts, where the modern border is between Sudan and Egypt. You find major forts, really extensive, beautiful forts, really, built by the ancient Kemetic people facing toward the kingdom of Kush. And so you start to see that when you look at the archaeological evidence, that this is not just some fly-by-night kind of windy kingdom. This is a significant kingdom, and the Egyptian people, the Kemetic people, take them seriously. It's one thing you can read from the literature. They would talk a lot about, crushing people and having people under their feet and that type of thing. But, when they talk about that with everybody, not just the Nubian people, they talk about that with everybody. But when you look at the archaeological evidence, you show a situation where there's a lot of respect here. There's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of economic trade going on in terms of gold and stones and precious things like ivory and ebony. And there is a respect militarily where this is not a people that are easily conquered or that can be ignored. So there's a long history that's more than just one that we see on the Kemetic side of things. There's a long history here. So we think, and one of respect, especially economically. So as we start to look at that, what more can we know about the city of Kerma and the ancient people of Kerma? Well, one of the things we know is that, they had this major urban area. They use a lot of mud brick. They use circular architecture, but we also know a lot about them from their burials, because, We don't have a writing system that survived that we know that we can tell that they use, but we know a lot about burials and archaeological evidence. So in addition to the major urban center, there is a huge burial mound to the east of the city, and it's called the Eastern Cemetery. And this Eastern Cemetery has in it some 40,000 graves. It has thousands of graves, and the cemetery itself lasts from almost the entire period of this Kerma period. This entire from the early part of Kerma up until the classic part of Kerma, this cemetery is in use. And what you find in the cemetery is huge burial mounds. You found a lot of information about them. You found huge burial mounds. You find people buried in situations, and this is a small kind of replica of it, but you find people buried in situations where they're laying on their right side. They're kind of in what I call a fetal position, but they're kind of crouched, and their heads are facing east. So they're facing toward the east, towards the rising sun. And you find that a lot in this area of the world, and a lot of places in ancient where they're buried with their heads facing east. You also see these mounds, and at the early part of the beginning of Kerma's history, these mounds are kind of they're simple. They're small in diameter, and they're somewhat equal based on whether you're a ruler or what have you. It seems to be somewhat equal. But as Kerma goes on, and more complexity to their society and to their kingship, you start to see huge burial mounds. I mean, like burial mounds that may be 300 feet in diameter. You start to see, as you can see in this picture here, you see this this skull of cattle and bull skulls. You'll see this cattle skulls, but in these huge burial mounds that develop, you find thousands of cattle skulls. You may have something that has 4,000 or 5,000 skulls buried with somebody who was a very rich ruler or king at the time. So you find huge burial mounds, huge amounts of skull and cattle buried with them. You also found humans. You find what is believed to be human sacrifice. You find human sacrifice in this area, and it seems to be for more than just a short period of time. It seems to be an extended period of time where they're using human sacrifice for whether this is maybe the king, and maybe these are family members or people who was believed that the king might need an afterlife for support or wherever that might be. It appears to be not only animals that are buried with the king and huge crania, but also human beings and people that are buried as well as a part of some type of sacrifice. You do see that. You see that as well. So these become very elaborate. You become to find a lot about what they're doing and the use of some of the architecture and some of the technology they use in terms of faience and how they make jewelry, how they make glazed items, glazed amulets, and pottery. And one of the things I want to mention is one of the things this area is known for is, in addition to the amazing burial mounds and the architecture with the dufufas and the use of cattle, is some of the finest pottery in the world. Now I'm not a person who like goes to museums and things like that to look at pottery. I'm not really a person who like looks at that. But as I've seen the pottery associated with ancient Kerma, it's really beautiful pottery. And I'll say, go to the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts that's in Boston, Harvard's Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. They have a lot of Nubian stuff. They have a lot of this pottery on display. They have a bunch of Nubian stuff. If you want to look at it, you can go online and look at it or visit. But one of the techniques apparently that, and as my earring goes, one of the techniques that they use to make their pottery is that they would take earthenware. They would take clay, and they would take this clay and apply certain paint onto it, and apply certain heat to it, where they would invert the clay and put it in a kiln or in a furnace and let it be exposed to a certain type of combustible material, which will help create the type of glaze on it. So the archaeologists, when they found some of this pottery and they compared it to other potteries and things that they'd found in other parts of the world for other excavations that they've done, they've mentioned that this is some of the finest pottery that they've seen. The techniques used, and this was done all by hand. And eventually I think they started using the wheel, but initially this was done all by hand, that the techniques used made this some of the most beautiful pottery they'd seen of anybody in the ancient world. So it was something that really stands out, and I encourage you to go look at it and take a look at it. But so their techniques around pottery, their use and their belief in spirituality, the centeredness of their religion. At some point in time, after a period of time, they were conquered. Eventually, after a couple thousand years of existence, after 1,000 years of the kingdom of Kerma and another 1,000 years of pre-Kerma, they were eventually conquered by the Egyptians for a period of several hundred years, and they adapt and look at and take on Egyptian ways. And there's a respect there. There isn't a complete domination where Egypt comes and they kill them and they dominate them right at once. It takes a long time for Egypt to do that. And even when Egypt starts to build its own cities on top of some of the Kerman areas and the Kerman fortresses, you see them allow the Kermic people and the Kushite people to still have their temples, to still have round circular buildings where they apparently are worshiping and apparently using as a temple. And this was something that was kind of like not very usual for the Kemetic people to do, to allow the people that they conquered to still have their architecture and their temples in use. But it appears that there was either a respect there, a respect for their temples, a respect for their deities, or a respect for the people in some way to allow them to still have some of their own culture and some of their things in place. So I'll share this. So these are just some of the things I wanted to share about the people of ancient Kerma to help you get an understanding. And I'll let you take a look at it again, that this was a vast area. This was a wide, vast area, a vast group of people who were doing many things thousands of years before Christ, who were contemporaries with ancient Egypt and ancient Kemet, who contribute and had a lot to contribute to the ancient world. They're people we should remember. So I want to kind of join that and just mention to you and invite you to learn more, to read more. I'll share some of the references here that you can see, places, additional things that you can take a look at, and additional things that you can look in terms of some of the resources that are used. But as I look at that, I'll ask you just to remember these amazing people and this amazing culture, and take a look at this. Share this with information, share this with people. And if you have any questions, let me know, because I want to come back with you more. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you.